And then, we will leave again some time for more of an interactive active session. So I'll let people add questions in the chat. So, hola a todos. My name is Lisa Arocha. And in today's Shaping El Futuro con Product, Cafecito and Accessibility Talk, we'll be discussing how you can start to drive change in your product organization. Now, before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in Hialeah, Florida, which is a suburb of Miami. Interesting enough, the motto of the city is La Ciudad que Progresa, the city that progresses, right? And I was born to two Cuban parents, making me a first generation American. So I grew up with a love of art, design. I studied graphic design and visual arts in college. And while I continue to love design, I started to just get more interested in the code side of things. And I taught myself to code and have since been a front end engineer. So now I've been coding for over 20 years and really enjoying that intersection between design and code. But about 7 years ago, because of my lived experience as someone who experiences migraines with aura, I started to experiment with assistive technology, things like a screen reader, right? That can help me if I was experiencing a migraine, which would happen a lot at work. So that I can still, feel productive, right, and do some work at work. And what I quickly found out in experimenting with that is that most of the web was really inaccessible. And so my passion for accessibility really started there, right? And finding out that, this gap that I wanted to change, right, in my organization. And from there, I started just learning everything that I could about accessibility. I became a certified professional in web accessibility. And within my own project team, I started to, kick off small initiatives, eventually, working towards specializing in accessibility full time. So today in my work at PwC, I lead the day-to-day efforts for our accessibility and inclusive design team. And our team sits as part of our products and technology organization. So my job really is to help teams understand, why is accessibility important? How do you integrate it into the product development lifecycle? I lead a team of, specialists, testers. We work with teams to make sure that our internal products and technologies are accessible, but that also, we are kind of championing it beyond our group to push it further, right? So today, what I wanted to focus on was, to share some of those practical tips and strategies that I've learned along the way. They've helped me, right? And I think that, regardless of your role in the product team, you could start to think about how you can start to drive change in your organization when it comes to accessibility. So I want to get started with, what accessibility is, especially in the context of digital products. So accessibility refers to the design, the implementation of products, services, and environments, right, that can be used by all people, regardless of their abilities. So in the context of this discussion, right, while accessibility is very broad, what we refer to as digital accessibility is accessibility that's focused on products, websites, mobile applications, right? And you might hear about accessibility in regards also to ADA compliance, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a very important law that gives access to reasonable accommodations to people with disability, and this extends also, right, to products and services as we start to provide and go more towards the providing services on the web. That same law kind of applies, right? So we look at that and we measure the compliance, right, with a set of standards called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. And those are really the guidelines that help us, understand, how do we meet those standards, and what is that minimum threshold, right? And I say minimum threshold because accessibility is so much more than just compliance. Compliance is the legal aspect of it. But at the heart of accessibility, it's about really considering the various types of people And who is your audience, right? Who are your users? Not only to ensure that you're giving that reasonable accommodation, right, and you're giving that compliance and equal access, but you're really providing an equal experience for everyone. The other thing I do want to talk about, and let me grab my cafecito here, is that accessibility helps everyone, right? It's not just for people with disabilities. We hear pushback from teams all the time that say, "Well, how many of our users, are disabled?" We don't know, right? That's a lot of disabilities are invisible. Mine's included, right? Some of them are temporary, right? They're only it's only when you experience something for a short amount of time. So it really is something that you want to be able to include as many users as possible, and it does extend, right, to not just people with disabilities, but it helps everyone. One example, right, and this is a concept that of how accessibility also extends to temporary and situational disabilities is, for example, you might design like a device for one person. Like if you're designing for a person that maybe has one arm, right? It can help someone that might have a temporary wrist injury, or a new parent even, right, holding an infant. So I just want to bring that up in the context of digital accessibility, because that's the number one thing that we get pushback on is like, why is this important, right? So always start with there. So, what I want to get into is, now that we have kind of level set about what accessibility is, and, what it's not, right? You're probably thinking, okay, great. I'm sold. I want to get started with doing this. I came to this session because I care about this and I want to start doing this work. So how do I do it, Lisette? The first step that I would recommend, right, is to really create a sense of urgency around the need for accessibility in your organization. It can be in your organization, it can be in your product team. Really start where you're at. Make sure that your stakeholders and your leadership are brought into that why. Why do you need this change? What are the business drivers? Work with them to define what are the requirements that we want to set to, and make sure that you socialize it throughout your product team or your either project, product, or organization, right? Because embedding a shift, and that culture of accessibility is more than just setting some requirements that you have to adhere to, right? It really does take more of that cultural shift to go from just requirements towards adoption, which that leads me to the second step, right? Make sure that you form a coalition. Now, when I first started, as I mentioned, it was 7 years ago. I was a front-end engineer, and I had that aha moment, right? That moment where I was like, wow, the web is a really inaccessible place. What can I do about it, right? So after I created that sense of urgency, I started to see, like, in my local office, how can I start to form a coalition, right? And it started really small. It was just made up of, people, again, in my local office that I knew, cared about and would champion accessibility in their respective projects. So we would have a monthly meetup where we would discuss some of the challenges, right, that we might come up with as we were working through this. We would talk about, ways that we can, further socialize it and get, more people kind of in the fold, right, caring about this. We started to develop more, trainings around it, right? Official days at the office. Like, we started to celebrate a Global Accessibility Awareness Day, GAD, which happens in May. And, putting in tidbits in our company newsletter that, talked about the importance of accessibility. So, that little spark, right? That small coalition, it started to kind of, like a little chispa that, just started to kind of, take off, right? And from there, it's just grown and grown, right? So I would say, do what you can to really, get that coalition off the ground. Start where you're at, and start to grow it, right? as you start to grow it, make sure that you are thinking about, how you can form alliances that, might be outside of your immediate product team or your discipline, because that really does help to spark those conversations, and see, if you're thinking about this, right? There's more than likely other people in your organization that are thinking about this, right? So that creates those connections that let you create that network, right, of people that care about this, to share, what are some of the challenges in your different parts of the organization. Just to share, how that kind of small, spark, right, that started just in my local office, started to grow out further. Today, in PwC's product and technology organization, we have a dedicated team of accessibility, testers, SMEs. We were able to establish a program to support accessibility, but it all started because of those, early conversations, those relationships that were built around the topic, right? And we're continuously, looking at how we could continue to expand that network. So that would be the second thing, after the urgency would be, that coalition, right? And continuing to grow that coalition. Once your coalition is organized, right, you can start to think, okay, how can I start to form a strategic vision around accessibility? Like, sit down really and think about, some questions about, like, what are some of the challenges that we are currently having to adopting accessibility, right? Is it awareness? Is it budget constraints? Think about the opportunities as well, right? What are some of the ways that you can start to scale accessibility? Do you have an existing pattern library? Maybe you can create one. What about shared components? What are some components that are used across multiple products, right? What tools does your organization have access to? Do you need to procure, accessibility testing tools that you can start to kind of socialize, right, with the different groups in your product team? And who do you need to go to request those tools? The other thing that I would suggest, right, around forming the strategic vision is, I want to kind of go beyond compliance, right? And what are some ways that you can do that is by including people with disabilities in the design process, right? There's a saying, like, there's nothing about us without us. So that's an important aspect as well. And you can start to integrate that by, seeing if your organization has an existing employee resource group, right? What are some ways that you could tap into that to get some feedback? Whether it's, through, maybe giving them, like, reinvest opportunities, right? Or small perks. But really, what I'm getting at is that, that forming of the strategic vision is important, because it really helps you drill into those questions and map out, what you need to do, and plan out your vision, right? Where do I want to be in 1 year? Where do I want to be in 5 years? And what is my kind of blue sky for this organization, or for this, initiative, right? Create that sort of SWOT analysis, and make sure that, the initiatives and goals that you have set to define success are realistic. Because, one of the things that, working in accessibility now for 7 years, I can tell you about, is that, advocacy burnout is a real thing. You definitely, it's something where, you're constantly up against, right? Like, why this is the right thing to do, and telling people this is the right thing to do, but not, always up against those challenges. So what I would also, again, make sure of is that you are setting yourself up with realistic goals, right? Set your target around that SWOT analysis that you did. Get feedback. Like, feedback is so important, and iterate on what isn't working, early and often, right? There's this great quote by one accessibility specialist that is, progress, not perfection, right? I love that, because, so often we're like, no, but it needs to be perfect, right? But, perfection really is the enemy of progress. And, know that this isn't an all or nothing thing, right? The work that you're doing is important. And, no matter how small it is, any progress really is a step forward. So always keep that in mind as you're working to drive change in your organization and in accessibility. Now, we have our why, we have our coalition, we have our vision. We're ready to, roll up our sleeves, right, and start to do the work. But one thing I would, say is that, think about this, right? Accessibility, how you kind of roll out the plan of doing accessibility, right? Practicing accessibility is also important. And accessibility can be really costly if it's done at the end of the product lifecycle. So initially, a lot of people think, okay, well, we'll get the tools, right? We'll do the testing, we'll report it back to the team. But if a team gets handed a report of accessibility assessment findings, it could be really overwhelming, right? It can leave teams unsure of the time and the effort it takes to remediate. It causes frustration, right? And it just, again, it ties back to the advocacy, burnout, right? And making us kind of up against a challenge, right? So the solution to this is really think about in your organization, right? As you're thinking about that strategic vision and how you can start to work on that. How can you shift left, right? How can you go from that more reactive testing and remediating approach where you're just finding issues and giving it to people to fix, to let's make this part of the way that we work, right? We want to make sure that we're identifying issues sooner, and and not having to create this in the first place, right? This is a term known as shifting left. And it's really important, again, to help us avoid those costly remediation problems at the end that, again, cause frustration across the board. So, in our team at PwC, our motto is shift left to build right. And it's really embedded in the way that we work with product teams. We focus on, what are the tools, what are the learning resources, what are the job aids that are tailored to each role in the product team, right? That way, everybody knows exactly what they need to do within their role to build an accessible product. A PM knows they have to give everybody these checklists, right? They have to make sure that they embed the tools and budget. They embed budget in their project plans, right? For some accessibility testing, they know to, again, set up certain touch points with our team in order to check in. The designers know, right, they have the tools that they can design with, right, and make sure that they're annotating their designs. The developers have, their automated tools as well that they can use to, in the process of development, start to, again, find and fix really quick. And then lastly, the QA teams know as well that, accessibility testing is crucial to find those harder things with like assistive technology, right? That might not have been found along the way. So this brings me to my last point. We talked about, what accessibility is, how you get started. As you're, starting to really, practice this in your organization, make sure that you're celebrating those small wins, right? Recognize and celebrate achievements. That reinforces the initiative within the organization. It's not, shifting left is not a one-time effort, right? It really is an ongoing practice that really needs to be ingrained in the way that we develop products, right? It's about creating a mindset where accessibility is considered from the very beginning and integrated throughout the entire process. So, I always bring in, an example where, we think about agile development, right? When I started my career, I remember, and I'm aging myself here, but, we waited until a design was like pixel perfect, right? And then it would waterfall into development, and then it would, go into QA. And we learned that there were some limitations, right, to that approach, right? and that failing fast and being agile are important. And it's the same for accessibility, right? You need to be able to kind of be agile and see what's working within your organization. Fail fast, right? Iterate on what's working, what's not working, right? And those small wins, and even the small fails, right? They're all opportunities to learn and to look and to say, okay, here's what's working, here's what isn't working. Allow yourself the time to reflect and shift your approach, right? It's not a one size fits all. It really is something that is a culture shift that needs to happen, and that does differ from organization to organization. But I hope that these 5 steps have given you at least some practical tips and some strategies that you can start to incorporate, and get you started on your accessibility journey. So, with that, I know we only have about 8 minutes, but we'll take some questions from the chat. Any questions? How many people here are practicing accessibility in their day to day work? I see Diana, you have a special interest in accessibility. Would love to connect on LinkedIn. Thank. It is a whole other world for sure. But I think especially as a developer, you hold a lot of power, I would say, right? To really make sure that the product is accessible, right? Because you're the one that's building the product. So definitely developers are the best champions. So I would continue to fight that good fight. Oh, I didn't realize there was a Q&A. So beyond the compliant requirements for accessibility, is the rest of the work proactive? If so, how do you choose the type of accessibility work to do, or reactive and catering to the accommodations current employees have? Okay, so I think I'm trying to get to the meat of this question, right? Um, so it depends again, on your organization and what the scope of your work is, right? If the scope of your work is building internal applications that are used by employees, I think definitely would be good to have some sort of feedback cycle, right, where employees can provide feedback around maybe some accessibility challenges they might have using the internal products. Um, but I wouldn't say it would be catering to accommodations of current employees, right? Because the accommodations would be, for example, as a blind employee, right? I might need assistive technology to be able to do my job, right? That would be an accommodation. Creating the applications and products that are used, those should just be across the board, right? Accessible, right? It shouldn't be a use case based, but it should be the norm, right? Okay. Alt tags, semantic tags. Yes. So some of the things that you have to be concerned about, especially from a development perspective, are using semantic tags. You know, a lot of times, especially with Angular and React, it's very easy to just put like and then I'm speaking to the developers in the room, to put an on click on a span, right? And to forget about what HTML brings to the table. But HTML brings to the table accessibility. I mean, the more you use semantic HTML, the more accessible your product's going to be. So that would be I think for developers in the room, the number one thing to do to make sure that they are being accessible. And then we still have 3 more minutes. Yeah, I mean, think about it again. HTML is, the markup. that tells, a browser, right? Is this a button? Is it, a link, right? That meaning has to translate over to assistive technology, so that if I'm a user who's using, again, I'm going to give the example of a blind user with an assistive technology like a screen reader. They need to be able to know that, this button, because it's marked up as a button, right? That says, click here, which doesn't tell me much information. It's going to take me to a page, right? So think about not just the semantics, but also, the copy that you're putting in your elements. Is it going to be understood, right? As a solo element, right? So yeah, HTML is definitely something that, for the developers in the room, you want to kind of go back to basics and incorporate, right, semantic HTML. And again, like, if whether you're a developer, a designer, in the QA team, or a PM, right, accessibility really is something that everybody has a role to play. um, you know from a PM perspective, like, you might not understand the technical aspects of it, but you know that it's something important from a business perspective. It increases users to our products, right? It's the right thing to do. It keeps us from having legal ramifications, right, by being compliant. And then, in the use case of just even all of the technology that we're seeing today, coming out, right? There's so many use cases. I think ChatGPT recently came out with the ability to kind of, see text, right, and interpret it. That is being used right now in assistive technology to be able to tell, a blind user, like, what you're looking at is a green button, right? There's a lot of great technologies out there right now that are leveraging this. So it is about innovation as well. And a lot of you'll find that a lot of innovation actually has, that origin in an accessibility need. Okay, I think we might have time for one more question. If anyone has, let me go pop over to the Q&A and see. Do you use Lighthouse? Yes, Lighthouse is definitely a good tool to use. It has some, I guess, downfalls, right? Which is that you would only be able to test page by page, but it's definitely good to use within your development, because it's already in the browser, right? And it's already in your debugger tool that you use all the time. So Lighthouse is a great tool. It's built on the Q API, which, the Q is another tool that is really great. They have there's a number of plugins, like, Axe has a plugin. The Q has a plugin. I think, let me see some of the plugins I would recommend here. Accessibility Insights for Web is another great one. So definitely start with, again, the education aspect, and what can I learn about it? How can I start to talk to other people in my team, and in my organization, to see, how can I start to make those small sparks, right, of change, and start to build up from there. All right, everyone, I think we are at time. But I appreciate everyone's questions, and I am so happy to be here, and be able to share my experience with you all. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll happy to connect on LinkedIn.